In this video tutorial you will learn how to update or restore the configuration and firmware of an ED2-series IED. You can update the configuration and firmware of the IED using the Smart Monitor program or directly from the IED using a USB flash drive. Attention, when performing further actions it will be necessary to restart the IED, so before updating the configuration or firmware it is recommended to switch the IED to off mode. To update the IED configuration or firmware via the Smart Monitor software, open the menu and select one of the two items. If you need to update the configuration, select the menu item Update Configuration and Device, and specify the path to the new file. Note that the name of the new configuration file must match the name of the current configuration in the IED. After selection, the program will automatically check the selected configuration file, and if there are no errors it will be possible to continue the update. If errors are detected after selecting and checking the configuration file, a message will be displayed. To update the firmware together with the configuration, select Change Terminal Firmware and select the specified files. To update only the IED firmware, select the menu item Update Firmware and Device, and then the firmware files. Please note that in addition to checking for errors, the program checks for compliance with the IED firmware version. For example, if firmware version 7.1.1.1 is installed in the IED, when the configuration is updated, the new file must also correspond to the firmware version 7.1.1.1 of the IED. A similar check is performed when the IED firmware is updated. If there is a mismatch between the configuration and the firmware version of the IED, the following message will appear, in which case you must update them at the same time. You can see which firmware version is required for the configuration via the configurator software under Configuration Information in the firmware version parameter. The current firmware version of the IED can be found on the Smart Monitor information panel or via the front panel by going from the main menu to the information section. Also, if the downloaded configuration is intended for an older version of the IED firmware, it is recommended to convert the configuration for the current version of the IED firmware. You can learn how to do this in the ED2 IED configuration video tutorial Opening and Saving of Configuration File. After selecting the new files and if there are no errors, click OK. After the end of file downloading, in order to apply a new configuration or firmware, the IED must be restarted, which is indicated by a message in Smart Monitor and on the display of the IED. If the update is successful after loading the IED, the ready LED should be active on its front panel and the error LED should not be active. It is further recommended to check the operability of the IED and its functions before commissioning. To learn more about how to do this, see the ED2 IED testing video tutorial Checking of IED modules and functions in testing mode. If an error occurs when applying a new configuration or firmware, we recommend using the ED2 operation manual for troubleshooting, which can be found on the support website. You can also learn about troubleshooting from the Possible Malfunctions and Troubleshooting video tutorial for ED2 IED. If the errors cannot be corrected, you should perform a firmware or configuration restore. How to do this will be explained later. Another way to update the configuration and firmware is to update directly from the IED using a USB flash drive. Please note that USB flash drive shall have FAT or FAT32 file system format, and the memory capacity should not exceed 64 GB. Before updating, you must prepare the USB flash drive. In the root of the flash drive, create a directory named Update. To update the IED configuration, we put a new configuration file in this directory, and to update the ED2 firmware we put the firmware files core.rh and sh.rtb. The update files can be obtained from the manufacturer or its representative. After preparing the flash drive, insert it into the IED's USB port. In the main menu of the IED, a new section for operation with USB memory device will appear and open automatically. Next, select Updating and Authorize with the appropriate rights. The IED will then detect the current configuration and firmware version, as well as the versions of the files on the USB memory device. Moreover, the first four numbers of the configuration are associated with the firmware version of the IED, and the last two numbers indicate the number of changes made to the configuration, namely, first number, set automatically each time the configuration is successfully saved in the configurator software. The second number is also set automatically when changes are made to the configuration via Smart Monitor or the front panel of the IED. Next, mark the necessary items for the update and click Update. After the message about successful completion of the procedure appears, the IED must be restarted. If the error LED on the front panel is steadily illuminated during a firmware or configuration update, it may indicate that a critical error has occurred while loading the IED firmware or configuration. In this case, it is necessary to restore the previous version using the recovery mode. Before restoring, you should generate files for sending to the manufacturer. You can learn how to do this in the ED2 IED's video tutorial, Generate Files for Sending to the Manufacturer. The IED can be switched to recovery mode automatically or manually. Automatic switchover occurs after 2 unsuccessful attempts to load the IED. To manually restore the firmware, go to Service menu from the main menu of the IED and select Go to Recovery Mode. Then you should authorize with administrator rights and restart the IED. After loading the IED in recovery mode, go to Service Functions and authorize with administrator rights. Next, depending on what you need to restore, configuration, firmware, or all together, select the relevant item. For example, let's restore previous firmware and configuration. The IED will automatically detect current and previous versions of the files. Next, click the Recover button, wait for the message about the successful completion of the procedure and restart the IED. If the IED is successfully restored after loading, the ready LED should be active on its front panel and the error LED should not be active. To identify malfunctions that occurred before restoring previous versions of the configuration in firmware, it is recommended to send the previously generated diagnostic files to the manufacturer or its representative. In case of unsuccessful restoration of the configuration in firmware, i.e. if a critical malfunction persists, they must be restored to factory versions. Before doing so, files should also be generated for sending to the manufacturer, if possible. After that, in recovery mode, go to Service Functions, authorize with administrator rights and select Factory Firmware and Configuration. After determining the current and factory configuration in firmware, press Recover, wait for the procedure to complete and restart the IED. To identify malfunctions that occurred before restoring previous versions of the configuration in firmware, it is recommended to send the previously generated diagnostic files to the manufacturer or its representative. If a critical error persists after restoring the firmware and configuration to the factory versions, please generate the files for sending to the manufacturer once again and send them to manufacturer or its representative together with all previously generated diagnostic files. This video tutorial is over. We hope it was useful to you. Thank you for attention.